There's a smell that just doesn't belong in the dead of winter.
It's so warm and impossibly sweet. It can drive a starving man completely out of his mind.
I smelled it on a Tuesday. Snowdrifts were piled as high as the rooftops, and our village was quietly freezing to death. Then this scent of fresh, heavy bread drifted down on the bitter northern wind. It felt like a miracle. But out here in the deep wilderness, miracles are usually just traps. They're set by things that know exactly what you're desperate for.
I've been a tracker and a boundary keeper for this reservation for over 40 years.
I know the shape of a wolf's paw in the frost. I know the ancient laws. My job was never just keeping trespassers out of the woods. It was keeping our people out of the places where the old things sleep, especially the canyon to the north. We call it the Black Echo. The elders used to say that centuries ago, a piece of the night sky fell right into that gorge. They said the rock there was poison. They told us the water ran thick and pale, and nothing of this earth could ever grow in its dirt. We were taught to never even look in its direction. But starvation has a way of making people forget the rules. That winter was the hardest we'd seen in 3 generations. The cold literally snapped the trunks of old oaks in half. The supply trucks from the highway stopped coming when the pass got buried under 20 feet of ice. By December, our winter stores were already half gone. By January, we were rationing dried meat and boiled roots. People were boiling their leather belts to chew on the hide, just to trick their stomachs into feeling full. If you want to understand what happened up in that canyon, you gotta understand the betrayal that sent Mahala there. She wasn't a bad person, just a desperate sister trying to save a little girl with a failing heart. When the deep freeze set in, she begged the village council for extra rations. The council was run by Silas, a proud, rigid guy who only cared about the hard numbers of survival. He turned her down flat. He argued that wasting food on a dying kid was just going to doom the healthy workers. It was a cold, pragmatic call made by a man terrified of starving. But Mahala didn't care about pragmatism or council rules. She just wanted to save her sister. So, in the dead of night, she broke into the communal storehouse. She grabbed a heavy sack of dried venison and a jar of bear fat, hoping to slip away unseen. She almost got away with it too. But Silas was a light sleeper, and he caught her slipping out the back window. He stood there in the freezing dark, staring at the stolen food.
In a famine, the punishment for stealing rations was absolute.
The next morning, the whole village gathered out in the biting wind. Silas stood in front of the shivering crowd and declared that Mahala had stolen life from the rest of us. He didn't mention her sick sister at all. He only talked about the missing meat. The sentence was exile. Out here in the dead of winter, that's just a plain and simple death sentence. Silas forced her out of the village gates with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single wool blanket. We all just stood there and watched. She didn't shed a single tear. She just stopped and looked back at Silas. Her stare was so incredibly cold, it made the winter wind feel warm. It was a look that promised something worse than death. Then she looked right at me. I was the boundary keeper. I could have spoken up or offered to share my own meager rations to save her. But I kept my mouth shut. I let my fear of the council and the winter make my choice for me. 2 days later, her little sister passed away quietly in her sleep. The village mourned in total silence. We tried so hard to forget Mahala. We tried to convince ourselves we just did what we had to do to survive. But that guilt hung over us like a heavy shroud. 2 days later, her little sister passed away quietly in her sleep. The village mourned in total silence. We tried so hard to forget Mahala. We try to convince ourselves we just did what we had to do to survive. But that guilt hung over us like a heavy shroud. But we were the ones who were actually dying. The weeks dragged on, and the hunger became a living thing. It gnawed at our ribs and clouded our minds. Children stopped crying because they just didn't have the energy anymore. I spent my days walking the perimeter of the village. I'd check the snare lines, hoping against hope for a catch. But I found nothing but frozen dirt and empty traps. We were running out of time. Then came that Tuesday. The wind shifted, blowing down from the north. I was standing near the edge of the tree line when it hit me. The smell of yeast, toasted crust, and sugar. It was the scent of fresh, warm bread. It was so out of place that my brain refused to process it. I honestly thought I was hallucinating. I'd heard of starvation madness. They say your dying mind conjures the scent of a feast right before your body shuts down. But then I saw old man Elias step out of his cabin. He just stood there in the snow. His nose was tilted up to the sky, breathing it in. He smelled it too. Then Sarah, a young mother, walked out onto her porch. She was staring straight toward the northern ridges. It wasn't just me losing my mind. The whole village was waking up to this impossible scent. I knew I had to investigate. I tightened my coat and strapped on my snowshoes. As the boundary keeper, it was my job to know what was out there. Even if it meant crossing the line I swore to protect. I began the agonizing trek up the mountain toward the Black Echo Canyon. The snow was deep, and my legs were weak from weeks of starving. But that scent, it pulled me forward like a physical rope. As I got closer to the boundary, the smell changed. It wasn't just bread anymore. There was a strange, metallic sweetness underneath it. It made my mouth water, but it made the hair on my neck stand up. It smelled like the air right before a lightning strike. I crossed the tree line and stood at the lip of the canyon. The jagged black rocks jutted out of the snow like broken teeth. Warning. The elders warned us never to go down there. But I saw a thin column of white smoke and human footprints leading right down into the gorge. I followed the footprints down into the gorge. The descent was treacherous. The wind howled through the narrow stone corridors. It sounded like voices whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The further down I went, the warmer the air became. It was completely unnatural. Up at the village, it was 0 degrees. But down here, the snow was actually melting. It exposed patches of bare, slick black rock. Around it, a massive boulder, and stopped. Right in front of me was a wide, gaping cave entrance. The warmth radiating from the darkness was incredible, and the smell of baking bread was overwhelming. It made my stomach cramp violently. I unholstered my hunting knife and stepped into the cave. The walls were smooth, almost glassy. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something strange. The stone was pulsing with a faint, pale luminescence. The crunch of my boots echoed in the cavern. Suddenly, a voice called out from the shadows. "I knew you would come, Tracker." I froze instantly. My heart was pounding against my ribs. Out of the darkness stepped Mahala. She didn't look like a woman who had been exiled to die. She looked vibrant. Her skin was flushed with warmth. She wore a heavy apron made of woven cedar bark, and her hands were covered in a pale white dust. "Mahala," I breathed, slowly lowering my knife. "How are you alive?" I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. The whole village assumed she was dead within hours of her banishment. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The earth provides for those who are cast aside," she said softly.
She gestured behind her into the darkness.
"Come, you must be starving." I followed her deeper into the cave. The narrow tunnel suddenly opened up into a massive chamber. The heat in this room was intense. The walls were lined with thick, glowing white veins that looked like marble. In the center of the room was a large stone oven. A fire was roaring inside it, but the flames were a vivid electric blue. Arranged around the oven were dozens of perfectly shaped loaves of bread. They were golden brown and steaming in the unnatural heat. "Eat," she commanded, tossing a warm loaf into my hands. I didn't think. I couldn't. I tore into the bread like a starving animal. The crust shattered perfectly against my teeth. The soft, dense inside just melted on my tongue. It was the most incredible thing I had ever tasted. It was sweet, heavy, and incredibly filling. As I swallowed that first bite, a wave of intense, euphoric warmth spread through my chest. It chased away the bone-deep chill that had lived inside me for months. I ate the entire loaf in less than a minute, gasping for air between bites. When I finally stopped, I looked up. Mahala was just watching me, her expression completely unreadable. "Where did you get the flour?" I asked, wiping crumbs from my mouth. "There's no wheat out here. There's nothing but rock."
I found it, she said simply.
Deep in the tunnels, the stone walls are lined with it. Veins of white powder just waiting to be harvested. It acts like yeast. It acts like flour. It just needs water and heat. "That's impossible," I said. My mind was trying to reconcile what I was hearing with what I knew about the world.
Rock doesn't bake into bread. It defied every law of nature I had ever learned.
"You just ate it," she replied. "Did it taste like rock?" It hadn't. It tasted like life. But as the initial euphoria faded, I noticed something strange. The pale dust that coated Mahala's hands wasn't just sitting on her skin. In the strange blue light of the fire, it seemed to be shifting, almost vibrating. I looked at the walls of the cave. The faint luminescence was coming from thick veins of the same white powder embedded in the black stone. "This place is forbidden, Mahala," I said, my voice trembling. "The elders said a star fell here. They said the ground is poisoned." "The elders are fools," she spat, her eyes flashing with intense anger. "They're starving in their beds while clinging to ghost stories." She reminded me Silas threw her out here to die. But she didn't die in the freezing wilderness like the council intended. She found salvation in the dark rock of the canyon. Now she was going to save the people who threw her away. She walked over to a massive pile of that pale dust and started scooping it into a woven basket. She quietly told me they had already been coming to her. I just stared in shock. She tapped her nose, explaining how the scent drifts down to the village at night. The hungry ones, the desperate ones, they follow it up the mountain. For the past week, people had been sneaking up here. I demanded to know who was coming. She listed them off with a cold smile. Old Elias, Sarah, even the men who banished her. They came begging, and she fed them. I realized then what she was really doing. It wasn't just about survival. It was a slow, agonizingly perfect revenge. She was becoming their secret god in the dark. I took a step back and told her I had to warn Silas. Mahala just laughed. It was a sharp, bitter sound echoing off the glowing walls. She asked if a starving man cared about rules. She told me to go back to the village and watch them. She wanted me to see what happens when starving people realize they don't have to freeze anymore. Her confidence left me speechless. I left the cave without another word. My stomach was full, but my heart pounded with primal dread. The climb back up felt different. The fatigue was gone, replaced by a strange, buzzing energy. When I reached the tree line, I realized I didn't feel the biting wind anymore. The extreme cold simply didn't register. I looked down at the snowed-in cabins as the sun began to set. For the next few days, I just kept my mouth shut and watched. I didn't tell Silas what I found up there. I was too scared of what he'd do if he knew the truth. But honestly, I was just as afraid of the bread itself. The memory of that sweet, heavy taste haunted me. I craved it so bad my hands would shake. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, just staring out at the northern ridges. I had to physically fight the urge to put my boots on. I just wanted to walk right back into that canyon. I started tracking the villagers after dark. Mahala wasn't lying. Between midnight and dawn, shadows would slip out of the cabins. They'd just trudge silently up the mountain path. They didn't move like starving people anymore. They moved with this strange, synchronized purpose, like a line of sleepwalkers drawn by an invisible rope. I'd watch them come back hours later. Their faces were flushed, and their eyes were wide open. They were just staring blankly, looking right through the world. It wasn't just that they weren't starving anymore. They were changing. The ones who ate the bread completely stopped building fires. Their chimneys stayed cold in the dead of winter. I walked past Old Man Elias's cabin and saw him outside. He was standing in waist-deep snow, but he wasn't shivering at all. He was completely unbothered by the freezing wind. He was wandering through the blizzard in just a thin linen shirt. In the moonlight, his skin looked sickly and translucent. It had this faint, unnatural glow that made my blood run cold. The next morning, I finally tried to talk to one of them. I found Sarah standing perfectly still by the communal well. She was just staring blankly up at the gray sky. I walked up to her real slow, trying not to spook her. I asked how her kids were doing, hoping to see some spark of the mother I knew. But she didn't even shiver in that biting wind. When she finally turned to look at me, I had to force myself not to back away. Her eyes had completely changed. The warm brown was gone, replaced by this milky, translucent white that caught the light like crushed glass. She smiled at me, but her face was totally slack. No real emotion behind it at all. Her voice sounded distant, like she was talking through a long pipe. She whispered that they were all so full now, and that the cold didn't bite anymore. It just hummed. I stepped closer, feeling a cold sweat break out on my neck. I had to know what was happening to her. I told her that whatever bread they were bringing down from the canyon, it was doing something unnatural to them. She didn't even answer me. She just tilted her head, her milky eyes tracking a bird that wasn't even there. She said Mahala was kind, feeding them the dust of the stars. She told me they didn't need the earth anymore, because the stars burned so bright. Without another word, she just turned and walked away. I stood there in stunned silence. Her bare feet left perfect, unhurried prints right in the freezing snow. She didn't flinch or rush. She just glided away like a ghost. I stood alone by the well, my blood running cold. Holder's old warnings started echoing in my head. They always said a piece of the night sky fell into that canyon centuries ago. Mahala wasn't baking flour. She was feeding our people some ancient, dormant thing that had been waiting in the rock. Things went downhill fast after that. By the end of the second week, half the village was sneaking up to the canyon.
During the day, the whole place got eerily quiet.
The ones eating the bread started moving together, like a hive, totally ignoring the rest of us.
They didn't blink when they looked at you. They didn't even flinch when the wind howled.
But the worst part was, they started forgetting things.
I found old Elias sitting on a frozen stump near the woods one afternoon. I asked him about his late wife, a woman he'd mourned for 20 years. He just looked up at me with those milky eyes.
He told me he didn't know that name anymore, that there was only the warmth now.
Sure, the bread was keeping their bodies alive. The breaking point finally arrived when Silas discovered the truth. He wasn't blind to the changes sweeping through our people. He noticed the milky eyes, the cold chimneys, and the unnatural energy of the villagers. Driven by a desperate need for control, Silas decided to uncover the source of this contagion. One bitter night, he followed the heavy trail of footprints leading up the mountain. He marched through the deep snow, tightly clutching a loaded hunting rifle. I was already out in the woods, keeping my usual watch over the boundary. When I saw Silas trudging up the incline, I knew I had to intervene. I stepped out from behind a snow-laden pine tree and blocked his path. Silas didn't hesitate for a second. He immediately leveled the heavy barrel of his rifle directly at my chest. His gaunt face was twisted with anger and fear as he accused me of hiding the truth. I kept my voice low, warning him that he didn't want to go up there. I tried to explain that the unnatural food was changing our people into something else. I pleaded with him, telling him that bringing a gun would only make the nightmare worse. But Silas was too proud and too terrified to listen to reason. He roared that Mahala was poisoning the entire village under his watch. He wasn't giving up. He violently shoved past me and continued his march. I knew I couldn't let him face Mahala and the changed villagers alone. My heart pounded with dread as I followed him from a safe distance. Together, we descended the treacherous, icy path into the dark maw of the canyon. When we finally reached the cave entrance, the sweet smell of baking bread was overpowering. It hit me like a physical blow, reigniting that violent craving in my empty stomach. I had to bite my own tongue just to keep from blindly walking toward the warmth. Silas didn't share my hesitation. He stormed straight into the massive, glowing cavern with his rifle raised. His voice thundered off the glassy black walls as he screamed Mahala's name. Deep inside the chamber, Mahala was standing calmly by the massive stone oven. She was pulling a fresh batch of golden loaves from the electric blue flames. Dozens of villagers sat on the floor, their pale eyes reflecting the eerie light, completely ignoring Silas. Silas was losing his mind. He waved that rifle around, screaming at Mahala. He wanted to know what she did to our people. He accused her of poisoning them all. But the villagers, they didn't even blink. Mahala didn't even flinch. She just wiped that glowing dust off her hands. She looked at him like he was a joke. She told him she didn't poison anyone. She said she saved them. She fed them the dust of the stars. That pushed Silas right over the edge. He called them monsters. He stepped right up to her, aiming that rifle dead at her chest. He told her to step away from the fire. He was going to drag her back for a trial, or kill her right there. Even with a gun in her face, she didn't move. She just smiled. It was this awful, pitying smile. She told him he was small. She said he thought he was in charge just because he had a gun, but he had no idea what he was standing in. She reached into a sack next to the oven. She pulled out a handful of that glowing dust. She called it the ancient flesh of the sky. She said it had been waiting in the rock for thousands of years. It was hungry,
And she gave it our village.
You could see the exact moment Silas broke. He looked at the glowing walls. He looked at the blue fire. And then he looked at the bread. He hadn't eaten a real meal in months. His hands started shaking. He was just a starving man now. Mahala knew she had him. She picked up a warm loaf of bread and held it out. She told him she could see the bones in his face. She said she forgave him. She just told him to put the gun down and eat. I couldn't just stand there and watch. I yelled from the cave entrance. I begged him not to do it. Warning, I told him he'd lose his mind. I told him he'd end up just like the others. But he wasn't listening to me. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were glued to that bread. He closed his eyes and took a massive bite.
You could see the tension just melt out of him.
He let out this long, shaking sigh. Tears were streaming down his face. He was chewing like a wild animal. And Mahala just reached out and stroked his hair. Mahala thought she had it all figured out. She thought she was in control. But she didn't realize the dust just amplifies whatever's already inside you. And as Silas swallowed that last bite, everything changed. His eyes snapped open. They didn't turn that milky, peaceful white like the others. They turned a terrifying, piercing silver. He didn't look calm at all. He looked completely, violently consumed. He stared at those massive glowing veins in the walls. When he spoke, his voice had this unnatural, metallic echo to it. He said it was all his, that it belonged to the council. His desperate need for control had just mutated into pure, obsessive greed. For the first time, Mahala actually looked scared. She took a step back, her whole confident act just falling apart. She realized she had unleashed something she couldn't control. She tried to stop him, but that godlike authority she had was completely gone. Silas wasn't even listening to her. He reached into his coat and pulled out his hunting knife. He started pacing toward the wall, just muttering like a madman. He kept talking about the spring thaw, about selling the dust, about how they were going to be kings. Then he just lunged at the wall. He started hacking frantically at the stone with his knife, trying to gouge out huge chunks of the glowing dust. He was completely out of his mind with greed. There was no respect for what this thing was. Just pure, violent desperation. Mahala screamed at him to stop. She yelled that he couldn't just take it by force, that it had to be harvested gently. She tried to warn him that the rock was actually alive, but he couldn't hear anything over the sound of his own knife hitting the stone. He just hit the rock even harder. And the second that steel blade struck the deep vein of the dust, the whole cave reacted. This low, deafening hum started vibrating right through the floor.
It was so intense it shook the dust right off the ceiling.
The whole place just turned hostile. The blue fire in the oven flared up, shooting 10 feet into the air. The walls started pulsing frantically, and that soft, pale light from the dust, it shifted into this angry, burning red that made the whole cave look like it was bleeding. Then all the villagers sitting on the floor stood up in perfect, terrifying unison. Their heads snapped toward Silas all at once. Sarah stepped forward, and her voice was completely dead, but impossibly loud. She just looked at him and said, "You are hurting it." Silas turned with his knife raised, but the villagers swarmed him. They moved with terrifying precision. They didn't fight like individuals. They moved like a single hive mind. They tore at him with unnatural strength. Overwhelmed by their numbers, Silas dropped his knife. He screamed in terror, thrashing wildly to fight them off. But they dragged him down to the stone floor. Their milky eyes reflected the angry red glow. They were consuming him. The deafening hum of the angry cavern vibrated through the stone. It shook the very foundation of the cave. I screamed over the noise, warning Mahala. Above us, the ceiling began to fracture. Thick clouds of glowing red dust rained down. Massive chunks of black stone began crashing to the floor. Mahala stood completely frozen in shock. Her eyes were locked on the horrific scene. Her perfect revenge had spiraled completely out of control. The alien entity was defending itself. Realizing she wouldn't move, I sprinted forward through the falling debris. I grabbed Mahala hard by the imara.
I yelled at her to move as I pulled her toward the exit.
For a split second, she resisted. She couldn't look away. Finally, her survival instinct kicked in. We sprinted together toward the mouth of the cave. The walls buckled and heaved around us. The air grew thick and suffocating. The swirling, burning red dust choked my lungs and blinded my eyes. Behind us, a horrific crunch echoed through the chamber. A massive slab of black stone fell directly from the ceiling. It crushed the central stone oven and extinguished the blue fire. Silas's screams were abruptly cut short. He was swallowed. We burst out of the suffocating cave and into the biting air of the canyon. We scrambled frantically up the steep, icy path. Our boots slipped on the slick rocks. The earth was violently shaking us off. A deafening roar echoed from the depths of the gorge. The massive cave entrance completely collapsed in on itself. Thousands of tons of jagged black rock crashed down. It permanently buried Silas in the ancient dust. The nightmare was sealed. Exhausted and terrified, we finally reached the edge of the tree line. We collapsed into the deep snow, gasping for the freezing air. Our lungs were burdened. The violent shaking stopped. An absolute, eerie silence fell over the canyon. I looked over at Mahala. She was just covered in dirt and ash, shaking like a leaf. That proud, vengeful woman, completely gone. Just a broken survivor left in her place. She just stared at the dark gorge, whispering that she saved them only to kill them. I had to tell her the truth.
You didn't save anyone, Mahala.
You just fed them to something way older and way hungrier than the winter. We walked back to the village in total silence.
The adrenaline was completely gone by then.
All that was left was this bone-deep chill and the nightmare of that cave. Every single step through the snow felt like dragging lead.
The next morning, I gathered up the survivors who were too weak to make the trek.
I looked them right in the eye and lied.
I told them Silas and the others died in an avalanche.
I said Mahala survived in a shallow cave just eating roots.
I had to lie to keep them sane. Eventually, that brutal winter finally broke. The deep freeze lifted around late March, and the snow started melting.
The supply trucks finally made it back up the pass.
We buried our dead, restocked our shelves, and just tried to move on.
Mahala lived quietly on the edge of town after that.
She never brought up her sister again, and she wouldn't go anywhere near an oven. She just spent her days sitting on her porch, staring at the dirt with this hollow, haunted look in her eyes.
But the story doesn't end calmly.
It never really does when you mess with the deep woods. I still patrol the boundary lines out there. I still keep people out. But things are different now. There's this lingering wrongness in the dirt itself. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, when there's no moon, the wind blows down from those northern ridges.
And just for a second, I smell it.
That faint, impossibly sweet scent of warm bread just drifting through the freezing pines. We survived the famine, sure, but Mahala brought something ancient out of that canyon. That stardust is still here, just waiting in the bloodlines. If you're ever deep in the woods and you smell something wonderful, something that feels like salvation, turn around. Don't follow it. My watch out here. It's never really gonna end. You think the winter ice kills everything it touches, but some things just go to sleep in the dark. That alien dust, it seeped right down into the dirt, just waiting patiently for the ground thaw. Look at the village now. The canyon is sealed up tight. Thousands of tons of black rock burying that nightmare forever. But you can't bury the stars. I've seen the blue smoke leaking through the cracks. It's still breathing down there. Mahala just sits on her porch these days. Doesn't talk to a soul. Doesn't look anyone in the eye. She knows exactly what she brought back with her. She knows she didn't save us. You can wash your hands all you want, but you can't wash off the cosmos. It gets under your fingernails. It gets right into your blood. She's still tied to that cave, whether she likes it or not. And the kids, the ones born after the deep freeze, they always stand at the edge of the woods, looking north. Like they're listening to a radio station the rest of us can't hear. They're just waiting for it to call them back. I watch them from the trees, and it breaks my heart every time, because my whole job was to keep the monsters out of the village. But how do you fight a monster when it's already inside the people you love? This land is beautiful, I'll give it that. But it's a liar. It covers up its deepest scars with fresh snow. Makes you think everything is clean and new again. Don't let it fool you for a second. We always look down at the dirt for danger. We look for wolf tracks or broken twigs. But the real danger didn't come from the earth. It fell from the sky. And the sky is a mighty big place. I spend my days marking the edge of the world out here, carving deep warnings into the bark of these old pines, hoping to God it's enough to keep folks away from the canyon. There are places on the map that just shouldn't exist. Lines we drew to pretend we have some kind of control over the wild. But the Black Echo, we just crossed it out completely. If you ever find yourself out here, deep in the wild, way past the paved roads and the mapped trails, you're in a place where our rules don't mean a damn thing anymore. Sometimes I'll be walking the line and I'll find fresh tracks in the powder. Someone lost, stumbling around in the bark. Desperate people do desperate things when that deep cold sets in. And then the wind shifts, blowing down from the ridges, and you smell it. Something wonderful, something sweet and heavy that feels exactly like home when you've got nothing left. It promises warmth when you're freezing to death. It offers salvation when you're at your absolute lowest. It hooks you in like a fish on a hook, playing on everything you crave. If that ever happens to you, if you feel that unnatural pull dragging you toward the northern ridges,
I'm begging you, with everything I have, just turn around and walk away.
do not follow that scent into the dark. I know how much it hurts to be hungry. Believe me, I know the cold makes you crazy and makes you want to give up. Starvation is a terrible way to die. It's slow, and it's mean, and it strips you down to nothing but bone and regret. But at least it's natural. At least it's human. Because becoming a vessel for the things that sleep in the dark, letting that ancient patient dust into your blood. That's a fate far, far worse than just freezing in the snow. That winter was the hardest we'd seen in 3 generations. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it breaks you. We were completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was so absolute. It snapped the trunks of old oaks right in half.
You could hear them cracking in the dead of night, like gunshots.
It felt like the earth itself was given up.
The supply trucks from the state highway stopped coming by late November.
The main pass was buried under 20 feet of solid ice. Nobody was getting in, and we sure weren't getting out. By December, our winter stores were already half gone. You'd look at those empty shelves and feel your stomach drop. The panic started quiet, but it was there in everyone's eyes. By January, we were rationing out scraps of dried meat and boiled roots.
It wasn't enough to live on.
It was just enough to keep you dying slowly.
By the time I smelled that bread, folks were boiling their own leather belts.
Just trying to soften the hide enough to chew on it. Anything to trick your stomach into feeling full for an hour.
Hunger like that changes a person.
It strips away everything that makes you human. It turns you into an animal, just looking for the next bite. And that brings us to Mahala.
If you want to understand what happened in that canyon, you gotta understand her.
She wasn't a bad woman, but she was a desperate one. She had a younger sister named Ellen, born with weak lungs. When the deep freeze set in, the girl caught a fever that just wouldn't break. Mahala knew she was running out of time. She begged the council for extra rations, just a little fat to give her sister strength. But Silas was a man of cold, hard numbers. He looked right at her and said no. Mahala didn't care about pragmatism. She only cared about her sister. So she broke into the storehouse in the dead of night. She took a sack of dried venison and a jar of bear fat. She almost got away with it. But Silas was a light sleeper. He caught her slipping out the back window. The punishment for stealing rations was absolute. It had to be, or the village would collapse. The next morning, the council gathered in the freezing wind. Silas stood before the shivering crowd. He declared that Mahala had stolen life from the rest of us. He didn't mention her sick sister. He only mentioned the missing wheat. The sentence was exile. It was a death sentence, plain and simple. We watched as Silas forced Mahala out of the village gates. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a single blanket. She just looked back at Silas with a stare so cold it made the wind feel warm. She looked at me, too. I was the boundary keeper. I could have spoken up, but I remained silent. I let the fear of the winter dictate my actions. That silence is a weight I'll carry until I die. They pointed her north toward the Black Echo Canyon. We all assumed she'd freeze to death by nightfall. 2 days later, her sister Endlin passed away in her sweep. The village mourned quietly. We tried to forget Mahala. We tried to convince ourselves we did what was necessary. But we were the ones who were dying. The weeks dragged on. The hunger became a living thing that gnawed at our ribs. Children stopped crying because they didn't have the energy. The old folks just stayed in their beds, waiting for the end. I spent my days walking the perimeter of the village. I checked the snare lines. I found nothing but frozen dirt and empty traps. We were quietly, inevitably freezing to death. Then came that Tuesday.
The wind shifted, blowing down from the north.
I was near the tree line when it hit me. The smell of yeast, toasted crust, and warmth. It was so out of place, my brain refused to process it. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. You hear stories about starvation madness. Your dying brain conjures up a feast before the end. But then I saw old Elias step out his cabin. He was smelling it too.
Then Sarah walked out onto her porch.
She just stood there, staring blankly toward the northern ridges.
It hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't hallucinating.
The whole village was waking up to it.
I knew I had to go up there. I tightened my coat, strapped on my snowshoes, and started the climb.
My legs were basically useless after weeks of starving. But that smell,
it pulled me up the mountain like a rope.
The closer I got to the boundary, the stronger it got. It wasn't just Brad anymore.
There was something else hiding underneath it. A weird metallic sweetness.
It smelled like the air right before lightning strikes. I finally crossed the tree line.
Standing right at the edge of the black echo. Jagged black rocks stuck out of the snow like broken teeth.
We were taught to never look in this direction.
They said the earth down there was poisoned.
I expected to see monsters.
Or moving shadows, like the old story said. Instead, I saw a thin line of white smoke.
And footprints. Human footprints. Heading straight down into the gorge.
I followed them down. The climb was a nightmare. The wind was howling through those narrow stone walls.
It didn't sound like wind, though.
It sounded like voices whispering in a language I didn't know. The deeper I went, the weirder it got.
It started getting warm.
Too warm. The snow was actually melting off the rocks.
It felt like the canyon was breathing out its own heat.
I came around a massive boulder and slid.
A huge, gaping cave entrance.
The heat coming out of the dark was incredible.
And that smell.
It was so strong it made my stomach cramp up. I pulled my knife and stepped inside.
The walls weren't rough stone. They were smooth, almost like black glass.
And they were glowing. Just a faint, pale light pulsing in the rock. A voice echoed from the shadows, calm and steady.
It stopped me dead in my tracks.
Out of the darkness stepped Mahala.
She didn't look like a woman left to freeze. She was vibrant, flushed with warmth, her hands coated in a pale white dust.
I was so stunned I just lowered my knife.
She gave me this smile that didn't quite reach her eyes.
She told me the earth provides for the cast-aside. Then she gestured for me to follow her deeper into the cave. She knew exactly how starving I was. She led me into this massive dome-like chamber.
Right in the center was a huge oven made of black canyon stone.
Inside, it roared a vivid electric blue fire.
It burned with this silent, intense heat.
And all around it were dozens of perfectly baked, steaming loaves of bread.
She didn't even hesitate.
She picked up a warm loaf and tossed it right to me. She just looked at me and told me to eat. The smell of it hit me so hard my stomach cramped. It was a hunger so violent it actually brought tears to my eyes.
I didn't think. I just tore into it like a wild animal. The crust shattered against my teeth, and the inside just melted. It was incredibly sweet, heavy, and so filling. This wave of euphoric warmth spread right through my chest.
I devoured the whole thing in under a minute, just gasping for air. When I finally stopped, I wiped the crumbs from my mouth. I asked her where she could possibly find flour out here in the rock. She just pointed to the smooth walls of the cave. She said the stone was lined with veins of white powder. It acted like yeast, just waiting to be harvested. But as that initial high faded, I noticed something wrong. The pale dust coating her hands wasn't just sitting there. In that strange blue light, it looked like it was shifting. It
was vibrating on her skin.
And the glow in the cave was coming from those exact same veins in the rock.
I started shaking, telling her this place was forbidden.
Say in a natural American voice, urgent warning. The elders always said a star fell here, that the ground was poisoned. Her calm face suddenly twisted into this intense, bitter anger. She spat that the elders were just fools starving in their beds.
Silas threw her out to die, but she found salvation instead. She walked over and started scooping that glowing dust into a basket. Then she told me the villagers were already coming to her. They'd been following the scent up the mountain for a week, coming to her on their knees, begging for a crust of bread. And she was feeding them, keeping them alive in the dark. It was this slow, agonizingly perfect revenge.
I told her I had to warn Silas and the council.
She just let out this sharp, bitter laugh that echoed off the walls. She told me to go back and watch what happens when they stop freezing. I left that cave with a full stomach, but my heart was pounding with absolute dread. The climb back to the village felt completely different. That crippling fatigue was just gone, replaced by this strange, buzzing energy. I didn't even feel the biting wind on my face anymore. Over the next few days, I just watched the village change. I didn't tell Silas what I found, mostly because I was terrified of the bread myself. The memory of that sweet taste haunted me. I started tracking the villagers at night. Between midnight and dawn, shadows would slip out of the cabins and head up the mountain. They moved with this strange, synchronized purpose, like sleepwalkers. They'd come back hours later with flushed faces and wide, staring eyes. The ones who ate the bread stopped building fires entirely. I saw old Elias walking through waist-deep snow without a coat, not even shivering. I tried talking to Sarah one morning by the communal well. When she turned to look at me, I had to force myself not to pull back. Her eyes had changed into this milky, translucent white. She smiled, but her face was completely blank. She whispered that they were all so full now, and that the cold didn't bite anymore. She said Mahala was feeding them the dust of the stars. She just turned and walked away, her bare feet leaving prints in the freezing snow. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. It wasn't flour Mahala was baking. It was something ancient and dormant. Things escalated fast. Soon, half the village was sneaking up to the canyon. During the day, they moved with this strange hive-like coordination. They didn't blink, and they didn't even flinch when the wind howled. The bread was keeping them alive, but it was erasing who they were. I asked old Elias about his late wife, and he just said he didn't know the name. It was replacing their humanity. The breaking point came when Silas finally figured it out. So, one night, he followed the footprints up the mountain with a loaded hunting rifle. I stepped out from behind a pine tree and blocked his path. Silas leveled his rifle right at my chest. His face was twisted up with anger and fear. He snarled that I knew what was happening and kept it a secret. I tried to keep my voice low and warned him to stop. I told him the food wasn't natural and it was changing our people. Going in there with a gun was only going to make it worse. But Silas wouldn't listen. He roared that she broke the law and was poisoning the village. He shoved right past me, marching through the snow to put an end to it. I couldn't let him face her alone, so I followed him down into the canyon. When we reached the cave, the smell of that bread hit me like a punch. I had to bite my tongue just to stop myself from running toward the fire. Silas stormed right into the massive cavern with his rifle raised. His voice echoed off the glowing walls as he shouted Mahala's name. The heat of the blue fire was intense. Mahala was just standing there by the stone oven, pulling fresh loaves from the flames. Dozens of villagers sat on the floor, staring at the fire.
They completely ignored Silas. She looked up, perfectly calm, and wiped the glowing dust onto her apron.
She asked him with this mocking tone if he came to beg for a crust or to execute her again.
Silas yelled that she was poisoning them all. He pointed his rifle right at her and demanded she step away from the fire. He threatened to drop her right there.
Mahala didn't even flinch. She just gave him this terrible, pitying smile. She told him he was small and that he didn't even understand what he was standing in. She reached into a sack and pulled out a handful of the glowing dust. She whispered that it was the ancient flesh of the sky. It was hungry, and she gave it a village.
Silas finally looked at the glowing walls.
The rigid leader just broke. Underneath all that pride, he was just a starving man.
He hadn't eaten a real meal in months.
His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the gun. Mahala saw him crumbling. She picked up a warm loaf of bread and held it out.
It was the ultimate revenge.
The outcast, offering salvation to the man who condemned her. She told him to put the gun down and just eat. The weight of that moment was suffocating. Silas just stared at the bread.
The smell was intoxicating.
It promised an end to the pain and the bitter cold.
Slowly, the barrel of his rifle started to lower. I yelled from the entrance of the cave. I begged him not to do it.
I told him if he took a bite, he'd lose himself completely.
I wanted him to remember what happened to the others.
But he didn't even look at me. He dropped the rifle.
He took the bread from her with trembling fingers. He closed his eyes and took a massive bite. I watched the tension just drain right out of his body. He was crying as he chewed. Mahala thought she had won. She didn't realize the dust amplifies whatever is inside you.
The villagers just wanted peace. But Silas was driven by a desperate need for control.
When his eyes snapped open, they weren't milky white. They were a terrifying, piercing silver. He looked at the glowing walls and said it all belonged to him. He started talking about selling it when the thaw came. He pulled his hunting knife and started hacking at the rock. He was trying to gouge out the dust by force. Mahala screamed for him to stop, but he was completely gone. The cave reacted to his greed. A deafening hum shook the stone floor.
The glowing walls turned an angry, burning red.
The villagers all stood up at the exact same time.
They turned their heads towards Silas in perfect unison.
They descended on him like a single organism.
They didn't use weapons, just their bare hands.
Silas screamed as they dragged him down. The vibrations were tearing the ceiling apart. I ran forward and grabbed Mahala by the arm. We sprinted for the exit as the walls buckled. The air was thick with choking red dust. We burst out into the freezing canyon air. A massive roar echoed from the gorge behind us.
The cave collapsed, burying Silas and the dust under tons of rock.
We collapsed in the snow at the edge of the tree line, just gasping for air. The silence that followed was absolute. Mahala was trembling, covered in dirt and snow.
She finally realized she hadn't saved them.
She just fed them to something older and hungrier than the winter.
The next morning, I gathered the remaining survivors.
I told them Silas and the others died in an avalanche up on the northern ridges.
I lied. I had to protect whatever fragile sanity we had left.
The truth was a contagion, and it would have only bred more fear. And the winter eventually broke, and the supply trucks finally made it through. We buried our dead, rebuilt our stores, and tried to move on. Mahala lived quietly on the edge of the village.
She spent her days just sitting on her porch, staring at the ground.
She had this hollow, haunted look in her eyes.
But the story doesn't end cleanly.
It never does when you mess with the unseen wilderness.
Sometimes, in the dead of winter, I still smell it.
The dust of the stars is in the bloodlines now.